The moment Vivian Aldridge said her ex was back in town, she didn't look worried. She looked amused, almost curious about how Nolan Prescott would react. My ex is back in town and wants to meet up. You don't need the details. She delivered the sentence with a small smirk that hovered somewhere between confidence and provocation. Nolan Prescott simply nodded once. Okay. That was all he said. Vivian waited. She expected questions. She expected tension, maybe even anger. Instead, she watched Nolan reach for his glass of water and take a calm sip like someone listening to tomorrow's weather forecast. Something in his indifference unsettled her more than any argument would have. Vivian Aldridge had always been very good at reading emotional reactions. She worked in corporate consulting where emotional leverage was practically a second language. But Nolan Prescott had always been difficult to read when he went quiet like this. He had built a career in financial litigation in Greenwich, Connecticut, where patience and silence often won battles before the courtroom ever did. And in that moment, his silence felt deliberate. The dinner table between them suddenly felt larger than usual. Vivian studied him carefully. You're not curious? Nolan shrugged slightly. I trust you'll make whatever decision you think is best. The words sounded respectful, but the tone carried something colder than respect. Vivian leaned back in her chair. You're surprisingly relaxed about this. Nolan gave a faint smile. Should I not be? Vivian held his gaze for a second longer before breaking eye contact. That small reaction gave Nolan exactly the information he needed. The meeting with her ex was already decided. This wasn't a question. It was a test. Vivian Aldridge had a habit of testing emotional boundaries the way some people tested water temperature with their toes. Nolan Prescott had known this about her long before they married. But lately the tests had become sharper, more intentional, more public. Her ex's name was Adrian Calloway, a venture capital analyst who had briefly dated Vivian before she met Nolan. Adrian had always remained a quiet presence on the edge of her social circles. Occasionnel mention. Old stories. Half-finished comparisons. Nolan never reacted strongly to those stories. At least not externally. Because internally he had been paying attention to every detail. And when someone pays attention long enough, they begin to see patterns that other people miss. That evening, Nolan finished dinner calmly. He helped clear the plates. He washed the glasses in the kitchen while Vivian checked messages on her phone. The house in Greenwich had large windows facing the dark backyard where expensive landscaping lights cast long, quiet shadows across the lawn. Everything about their home suggested stability. But stability can sometimes hide fractures better than chaos ever could. Later that night, Nolan sat in his home office reviewing documents for a case involving corporate contract fraud. Yet his mind kept drifting back to the short conversation at dinner. Not because he felt threatened by Adrian Calloway, but because of the way Vivian had said the sentence. You don't need the details. It wasn't secrecy that bothered him. It was the assumption that he would simply accept being removed from the context of his own marriage. That assumption told him something important about how she saw the balance of power between them. And power imbalances rarely correct themselves without consequences. 2 days later, Vivian dressed carefully before leaving the house. She chose a navy dress that balanced elegance with effortlessness. Nolan noticed the detail, but said nothing. She paused near the doorway. You're not going to ask where we're meeting? Nolan looked up from his laptop. No. She tilted her head slightly. You really don't care? Nolan closed the laptop slowly. I care about a lot of things. But curiosity isn't always productive. Vivian studied him again. The lack of friction was becoming uncomfortable. She had expected resistance. But resistance creates control. Calmness removes the leverage entirely. Before leaving, she gave him one last probing look. You're being strange today. Nolan smiled lightly. I'm being observant. She left without replying. The sound of her car pulling out of the driveway echoed through the quiet house. Nolan remained seated for several minutes. Then he opened his laptop again and began reviewing financial records. Not work documents, personal ones. Over the past year, Nolan had quietly reorganized several financial structures connected to their assets. Nothing illegal, nothing deceptive, just careful planning. Because the moment someone begins testing boundaries, A wise person prepares for the outcome of those tests. Vivian returned home after midnight. She walked inside, carrying the faint scent of a restaurant Nolan recognized from downtown Greenwich. She placed her purse on the counter casually. "How was your evening?" Nolan asked. "Interesting." She opened a refrigerator and poured sparkling water. "Adrian is doing very well for himself." Nolan nodded politely. "That's good to hear." Vivian watched him carefully. "Don't you want to know what we talked about?" Nolan shook his head slowly. "If it affects our lives, I'm sure you'll tell me." Her smile returned again, but this time it was smaller, almost cautious, because she still couldn't tell whether Nolan's calmness meant confidence or distance. And sometimes those two things look identical until it's too late. 3 weeks passed. Adrian's name appeared in conversation more frequently. Subtle mention. Casual comparisons. Vivian never crossed a clear line, but she seemed to enjoy watching Nolan navigate the ambiguity. Then one evening, Nolan returned home earlier than usual. He found Vivian sitting in the living room, speaking softly on the phone. She ended the call quickly when she saw him. "That was Adrian," she said casually. Nolan nodded. "I assumed." She leaned forward slightly. "He invited me to a networking event in Manhattan this weekend." Nolan looked at her calmly. "Sound professional." "It is." She watched his reaction again. "Would you mind if I went?" Nolan paused, just long enough for the question to feel real. Then he said something Vivian hadn't expected. "You should absolutely go." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You're serious?" "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" Vivian leaned back in her chair slowly. "You're being unusually supportive lately." Nolan stood and walked toward the kitchen. Support is underrated in relationships. She followed him with her eyes, but something about his tone now carried a subtle finality she couldn't quite explain. The Manhattan event happened that Saturday evening. Vivian left the house confident, but she returned Sunday morning uneasy, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because Nolan hadn't texted once. Not a single message, not even a casual check-in. When she walked into the house, she found him sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee and reading a legal document. "You didn't ask how the event went," she said. Nolan looked up calmly. "How was it?" She hesitated slightly. "Adrian and I talked a lot." Nolan nodded once. "Good." Vivian set her bag down slowly. "You're making this very easy." Nolan smiled faintly. "Sometimes the easiest path reveals the most information." Before we continue, pause for a moment and think about this situation. If you were Nolan Prescott, would you stay calm the way he did? Or would you confront the situation directly? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is the moment where most people make the decision that changes everything that follows. 2 months later, the shift finally became visible. Nolan Prescott had accepted a senior partnership opportunity with a financial litigation firm in Boston. The offer had been in discussion quietly for weeks. Vivian discovered it accidentally when a congratulatory email appeared on Nolan's open laptop. "You moving to Boston?" she asked sharply. Nolan looked up from his desk. "I accepted the position yesterday." "You didn't tell me." "You didn't ask." Her voice hardened slightly. "What about our life here?" Nolan leaned back in his chair calmly. "I'm keeping the Greenwich house for now, but I'll be spending most of my time in Boston." Vivian stared at him. "You're making a major decision without discussing it with me." Nolan folded his hands thoughtfully. 2 months ago, you explained that some conversations didn't require details." The words landed quietly between them. Not aggressive, not emotional, just precise. Vivian realized something then that unsettled her deeply. Nolan Prescott hadn't been passive. He had been recalibrating. Their marriage had slowly shifted from shared decisions to parallel lives. Not because of anger, but because of adjustment. An adjustment often carries consequences long before anyone recognizes them. 6 months later, the distance between Boston and Greenwich had become routine. Phone calls were polite but brief. Visits were scheduled around work obligations. Vivian still saw Adrian occasionally in social circles, but something about those meetings now fell hollow. Because the tension she once used to measure Nolan's reactions was gone entirely. One evening, she called Nolan unexpectedly. "Are we still married?" she asked quietly. Nolan paused before answering. "Yes, but we're also two people making independent decisions. Just like you suggested that night at dinner." Vivian sat silently on the other end of the call. For the first time since that conversation months earlier, the emotional weight of her words returned to her clearly. And words have a strange way of shaping reality once they're spoken aloud. Before the story concludes, consider one more question. If someone slowly withdraws instead of arguing, is that maturity or the quiet end of a relationship? Let us know what you think, because this moment often defines how relationships either evolve or dissolve. A year after Adrian returned to town, Nolan Prescott finalized his permanent relocation to Boston. The legal paperwork for a marital separation followed shortly afterward. There was no dramatic confrontation. No scandal. No accusations. Just two signatures on a document acknowledging what had already happened emotionally months earlier. Vivian Aldridge remained in the Greenwich house for another year before eventually moving to Manhattan for work. Adrian Calloway stayed a distant acquaintance. The connection that once seemed exciting slowly revealed itself as ordinary. And sometimes ordinary arrives too late to repair what ambition and curiosity quietly weakened. Nolan Prescott continued building his career in Boston. He rarely spoke about the marriage publicly, but colleagues occasionally noticed how deliberate he had become about emotional boundaries. Because when someone experiences a subtle shift in loyalty, they often learn a permanent lesson about attention and respect. And those lessons rarely need to be spoken out loud.